Hey y'all, Southern Sleuth here, and I'm back with another new type of series. I'm finding that I have more inspiration when I allow myself to jump around and do what I'm excited about that week, versus keeping myself in a bubble until I complete every video for every game in one particular series. Besides, variety is the spice of life. But don't worry, I do have every intention of completing my Which Dog Breed videos, and then continuing to do my Culprit lore, or not Culprit lore, just my fake lore videos. So, welcome to a whole new series that I'll be putting out for videos for as inspiration strikes. Have you ever wondered what a Nancy Drew game would be like if someone else had been the culprit? The whole point of solving a mystery is to figure out who had the means, motive, and opportunity. If someone has all three, they're going to typically be your guy. So suspend your belief with me for just a moment, since we'll be adjusting the means, motives, and opportunity, and let's give a different character the title of Culprit. For this series, we're starting with Curse of Blackmoor Manor. It goes without saying, but I will say it. There will be major game spoilers. I'm talking in-game, culprit, plot points, everything. So if you haven't completed Curse of Blackmoor Manor, I really do recommend skipping this video and waiting for the next one. Besides, an alternative culprit is not going to make a lot of sense if you don't know who the normal culprit is. Anyways, alright, leave this video in 3, 2, 1. Let's get sleuthin', y'all. You might be wondering why I'm starting out with Curse of Blackmoor Manor. It's not the first game in the series that I played. It's not the first game in the series at all. It's not the last game, and I didn't spin a wheel and let it pick for me. It's undoubtedly a great game in the series, but that's not why I chose it. I chose Curse of Blackmoor Manor because the alternative culprit was already written for me. Well, sorta. I first played Curse of Blackmoor Manor when it came out in, 2004? And if I remember correctly, it was just me and my little sister playing it at the time. I think that was who I was playing these games with in that year. We got really, really close to the end and then got stuck. And I don't remember what it was exactly, but either we couldn't find all the keys to get the columns open, or we got the columns open, but no matter which way we turned the pipes, no water came through, no sound came through. We weren't triggering something right around that time in the game. So we went back to the walkthroughs, which if you recall during that time, the only walkthroughs that you had were just these, Word document looking, typed up, start to finish. Sure, you could control F and try to find certain keywords, but it was really hard to get through these walkthroughs, especially if you're in the middle of a game without finding out major spoilers. But we'd already been through most of it, so we figured we were pretty safe. So we start going through. We're looking, how do we turn the pipes? Which way do they go? Do we need anything else? Or where were the keys? Can't figure it out. So we go all the way to the top of these walkthroughs, and I think we looked at several. And we start retracing our steps. And obviously you cannot repeat dialogue with the characters, but we basically walked the entire game multiple times trying to figure out what we had missed. And at some point, it ended up talking about finding that piece of paper about Jane's guinea pig that you see in the basement behind that door that eventually ends up filled with water. And at that point in our game, it was already filled with water, so we couldn't open it up anymore. And we were convinced that because we had missed it, we were hard locked and we were not going to be able to complete the game. And as kids, those games took forever. I mean, sometimes they still do, because I don't really think I've gotten any better at solving puzzles since I was little. But either way, we eventually found a walkthrough that either gave us enough information that we figured out who the culprit was, or did tell us who the culprit was. We felt satisfied enough to stop playing the game. I want to say that maybe 2 years or so later, I went back and played it again and completed it that time, but I was so young that my memory is a little fuzzy. However, I did replay the game just last year in 2023, and when I got to the culprit reveal, hey, big spoilers ahead, leave if you don't know, I did think I was not at the end of the game because Jane showed up, and Jane was not the culprit. So clearly this was just some clever cutscene. Then she'll leave, the real culprit will show up, or the real culprit will use her, she'll be bait, hostage, something, whatever. Except no other culprit showed up and the game ended. And I was left dumbfounded. All I could think was, isn't Nigel the culprit of Blackmoor Manor? Y'all, listen. For 20-ish years, I had remembered the culprit as Nigel. I don't know if I had a dream, if I just made it up, but I can hear his villain monologue to Nancy, and I can see him standing over the desk in the lab and messing with stuff, and so what if he was the culprit? What would have been his motive? Well, now that I've admitted that my brain is broken or something, let me tell you how the game would go. As far as puzzles and characters go, I'm not really changing anything there. You still get to play way too many board games with Jane, and nothing really changes until you start getting to items that we find that originally pointed us to Jane will now point us to Nigel. And there's some, different dialogue, things of that nature to help point us towards Nigel. Still the same characters, still the same beloved manor. Either one. Is there a difference between a mansion and a manor? I'll Google it later. Back to the case. Nigel Mukherjee is a boring researcher, right? He writes countless memoirs of historical figures, leaving out no minute detail, but also absolutely bringing no fire to the information. Even Nancy comments on how boring his memoirs are, and she happily does everyone's chores without complaining. So if she doesn't find chores boring, but she finds his memoirs boring, this makes Nigel really, really boring. He writes with no opinions, no lore, nothing but the facts. Except, what if this is just what he wants you to think? Not too long before Nancy makes it to the Penvillant house, Nigel is hired to study up and record a more complete account of the Penvillant family. He is known for not skipping a single detail, which is ultimately what Hugh wanted when he hired him. Little did Hugh know, Nigel had his own agenda for coming to the manor. But more on that later. Let's get to how the game would play out a little differently, and then at the end, I'll reveal what I thought was the motive all along. We, as Nancy, arrive at the Penvillant house with a low, startling growl and red eyes coming from the bushes, hissing Nancy's name. This might have been Nigel's first attempt to scare Nancy away. You see, he's a researcher, so it would completely make sense that he did some sort of background check on Nancy and discovered her expertise in solving cases, and then would have felt entirely threatened by her appearance at the manor. Can't have no amateur detective solving the family secrets before he can. There would have been no more Nigel scares until after they met. Mrs. Drake then gives her spiel, explaining to us, "No, child, you Americans are always seeing things in the English more something something." And she warns us not to get our shoes muddy outside and to track it all in the house. Nancy goes about her merry way, visiting Linda and meeting Jane. Linda doesn't really want to talk to Nancy, but does appreciate her concern. Jane, however, is over the moon to have someone else in the house, admitting she tried to get Nigel to play games with her, but he only participated in one before trying to sway her interests. While off exploring on her own, Nancy is walking around the hallways that lead back to the burned kitchen, more on that later, and she finds muddy footprints walking in front of the coats of arms. Mrs. Drake isn't gonna like that. But back about talking to Jane. We ask her about the taped-off kitchen, and she tells us everyone blames her for the kitchen fire from trying to experiment on the parrot Lulu's food, but she swears she turned everything off before she left the kitchen. We learn about her monster's What and Why book. Who gave it to her? Nigel. Because, well, someone had to get the ball rolling to keep Linda busy and also to keep Jane busy. So, I guess at this point we need to go meet him. Entering into the library, we finally meet the man himself. Like normal, he explains how he's been researching the family, learning about the Blackmore beast, and really surprising Nancy about how much he knows, considering, as far as she knows, he hasn't been there very long. Nigel brushes it off, saying he had just done some pre-research before coming. He also says, like normal, he doesn't know anything about runes. When Nancy asks about Linda, Nigel dismisses it. says she just misses her husband. Nothing more than that. A little bit of a drama queen, I guess. Later, Nancy sees Mrs. Drake on her hands and knees cleaning the mud. She accuses Nancy of going outside and threatens to tell Hugh to tell Nancy to leave. Mrs. Drake also can't seem to stop sneezing and mumbles something about having to find her medicine. When Nancy visits Linda again, Linda complains about Jane, talking about how Nigel had been speaking with Jane about the Blackmore beast and how Jane wanted Linda to know about it and what she thought about it. Apparently, it kind of freaked out Jane more than Jane really wanted to admit, and she seemed to just want to spend some time together with Linda because, well, it's a big empty manor. Nancy comments about how it must be hard without her dad around, especially when she's being told ghost stories about her house that are scary but couldn't possibly be true, and asks Linda if she's reassured Jane that the stories are just stories. Linda quickly ends the conversation telling Nancy she needs to leave. On her way out, Nancy sees an empty bottle of hair growth tonic in the corner of the room, hidden behind one of those very awkwardly covered chairs. Is Hugh balding? Nancy can't remember. We run through similar scenes with Jane and Ethel, learning about the tutoring, finding out Ethel wants Nancy gone too. Does anyone want Nancy here? But when exploring Jane's family tree, Jane actually has a few new things she can tell us. When we ask about Eleanor, Jane gives us in detail that Nigel taught her about how Eleanor might have been a changeling, and her husband might have been the first original Blackmore beast. I think it was her husband. Jane asks if Nancy believes in beasts, and admits it's the first interesting piece of history she's learned about her family. Apparently, she thinks Ethel's lessons are really boring. Even though Jane claims to find it interesting, there is an edge of nervousness in her voice. Then, board game time. When we win, Jane actually does tell Nancy that Nigel had played a game with her in exchange for a key she had to a door at the opposite end of the hallway, but she never actually learned if he tried to do anything with it. He wouldn't play any more board games with her after that. He claimed he was way too busy. Sometimes, though, Jane would go looking in the library for him, and he wouldn't be there. And then Lulu. Oh, the Lulu. If y'all don't know this, I love Lulu. She's an animal, and she's hilarious, and she's annoying, and it wouldn't be Blackmoor Manor without her. And yes, you can still get a second chance by feeding her the wrong food. All second chances remain, for sure. Lulu admits to us that it was Nigel who set fire to the kitchen. But Jane got blamed, because no one believes a parrot. When Nancy tried to press Lulu about what Nigel was doing, we get nothing. Shocker. Even after a yummy cake, she only admits to us that, well, Jane makes the cakes better. Thanks. Later that night, Nancy awakens with someone trying to rattle at her door, and then, when she goes out to investigate, finds scratch marks on her door frame. At this point, she has called about the book and learned about lycanthropy, and begins making comments about, is it possible Linda is experiencing Beast of Blackmore symptoms? She later finds a letter opener on Nigel's desk that has clearly seen better days. Nancy completes Nigel's typing task and gets access to his computer. It's there that she learns that Nigel is convinced Corbin Penvillin came to Blackmoor Manor. Why? To finish Eleanor's mystical arts, and Nigel has been to France to visit Corbin's childhood home and a secret room in which much of the decor mysteriously matches some of the more intricate pieces here at Blackmore. Nigel also admits in his writings that he is convinced this will lead him to the treasure. He also discusses how he knows the Mercury statue means something, but he has yet to figure out exactly how to get the wand and to make it worth something. His memoirs also explained how he had actually noticed the Penvillins when he was visiting the southwestern United States at the same time they were. After researching the family, after this chance meeting, he began to orchestrate a way to get on Hugh's radar and get himself hired so he could further explore this alleged treasure. This explains why he knows so much about the family. He wants the treasure. But what is the treasure? As we get further into his information about the family, we learn that there is a relation to the Philosopher's Stone and the Penvillin family. So how much does Nigel know? He talks about playing Betty, so how much does he know about the secret passageways? Nancy doesn't know yet, but her suspicions are rising. When Nancy goes into her room that night, she notices someone's been in there. Her bed's a little disheveled, her suitcase is open, and there's been a drawer that it looks like it might have been forced open. Oh, and also a letter on the floor that threatens her that she should leave. That too. Nancy begins finding missing pieces for the foyer's columns. That night, a lady in black comes. Nancy goes to chase after her and finds the red goggles outside Jane's room. Is it possible Jane was the one that tried to scare her? Nancy goes to visit Jane the next morning. Jane gets to talking and admits she stole a book from Nigel's things about alchemy and runes. But wait a minute, I thought Nigel didn't know anything about runes. According to Jane, her ancestor Randolph the Red was given a stone for winning battles against the French. Now we're starting to link things together. Nancy confronts Jane then about trying to scare her that very first night with the red eye goggles, and Jane does admit the red eye goggles are hers, but promises they've been missing since the night before Nancy got there. Getting close. Let's keep going. Nancy learns about the second passageway from Linda, who admits she had let something slip to Nigel, and how he had really pushed her for more information, to the point she asked Hugh to fire Nigel. Hugh clearly did not, but Linda started to feel bad shortly after that and was blaming the curse in the basement, so really now she had no energy to try to get Nigel fired. Although she doesn't tell Nancy what the curse is doing to her, she does admit the rest of it and again emphasizes how Nancy needs to leave. Same as the normal gang. You can picture it. Alright, we're getting there. Nancy moves the statue of Mercury and Nigel screams. But, I don't know, maybe that was a scream of excitement? Jane gets a threatening letter. Nigel says he's leaving. This place is haunted. Ethel is still just creepy. And no one wants her gone? Mrs. Drake finds a whole row of her plants dying. She is now too busy and too distraught to talk. So that takes her off the list of people we can talk to. Nigel's gone, so we can't talk to him anymore. Jane is all freaked out from the letter and accuses us of doing it because we're the newcomers to the mansion. And now she won't talk to us. We try to tell Linda that someone is clearly trying to scare her off to get them to leave the manor, and Linda loses it and tells us to get out for our own safety. Or Nancy's own safety. Great. No one will talk to us. You know what that means? We're nearing the end. Nancy gets to the forge, everything you're used to, read the notebook, take a look at the tall drink of water. Oh no, we need a key. Turns out the forge isn't lit, so you have time to do that, so you gotta leave, and then you can make the key when you come back. And then you do come back, bam, culprit time. So here's how I remember it. Nigel's at the desk, back to us. He's got potion bottles all around. He's got scrap paper all around with clearly what looks like instructions on it. Some of the bottles are probably bubbling, some maybe smoking. When Nancy walks in, she wasn't expecting to see Nigel, so she gasps. And then Nigel hears her, turns around. He's now notified of her arrival. He exclaims, "You found it! You found it, Nancy! I wanted you to be gone to get out of my way because you asked too many questions and make it too hard to look in Bridget's room. But you were actually what I needed all along." Shocker. He takes the key from Nancy and opens the lock just to find the stone. He goes on to explain how it's the Philosopher's Stone, and once he grinds it to dust, he can live forever. Nancy asks him why, and he admits he's lived a boring life, researching history and never making any himself. With the stone, he can now make a tincture that will make him rich as he helps other people live forever. But why did the Pimblins have it in the first place? Turns out they were the protectors of the stone. That was the whole family secret. They weren't supposed to use it. That's just too much for any one person to be able to control. They were supposed to protect it. That's why they had all of these riddles. To protect. And then my memory ends just like the normal one. Nigel gets stuck under the giant metal cage. Nancy has to get him out. But how would the final letter be different? Dear Ned, turns out there is no beast of Blackmore, just a madman of Mukherjee. Nigel had everyone fooled. He'd been learning about the Penvlin family for even over a year before he came to Blackmore. He was convinced the stone one of the ancestors had been gifted was the Philosopher's Stone, and that he could grind it down to make some type of fountain of youth elixir. When he had tried to follow Linda into the passageways, she had threatened to have him fired. He knew he had to get her out of the way, so he slipped her Mrs. Drake's allergy pills, some hair growth cream he stole from Jane's room and then put it into Linda's lotion, and he planted the books and stories of the Blackmore beast into Jane's head so she would bring them up with Linda. He knew Jane would share with Linda, because Jane is obsessed with winning Linda over. As for Mrs. Drake's plants, it turns out Nigel had been using them to try to perfect his elixir using the alchemy book Jane had found. Clearly his mixtures weren't going so hot without what he knew was the secret ingredient, the Philosopher's Stone. Trying to make the mixtures is also what burnt the kitchen down. He'd had a few explosive combinations. Nigel will get what he wants though, being part of history. He will be known as the plant killer behind bars. At least, that's what Mrs. Drake keeps saying. Thankfully, Hugh is back with his family and Linda is on the mend. When I left, the two of them, plus Jane, had sat down to play a game out of her hope chest. No talk of beast at all. Love, Nancy. If you liked this video, consider giving it a like and giving me a follow. You can also find me on Instagram under the same name. Thanks for sleuthin', y'all.